Hi, everybody. It's sort of like doubles in tennis. Susan and I are going to be sort of going back and surfing back and forth, and I'm going to start with the contents page. If I can get, hold on a second. Okay, here's what we're going to cover. We've got themes covering different kinds of romances: Phineas, Violet, and Chiltern. And then you got Madame Max, Marie, and the Duke, and Phineas sort of in the background. The Phineas, Finn, and Mary Flood Jones, not much of a romance, but I think, as you know in these chapters. Then we've got another duel besides the one of Phineas and Chiltern, and that's between Lady Glen and Marie. We're going to talk about Laura's despair deepening, and she leaves Kennedy she's very sad, as we will discuss. Then we're going to talk about parliamentary politics, power versus principle, and Phineas. We're not going to go too granular to get into all of the details of the legislation, but Susan will explain that. We're going to talk about Phineas going back to Killaloe as a hero. And then Susan's got a very fascinating graphic about the structure of the novel. And then we'll end with questions for the breakout rooms, which Susan will post in the chat to make available for everybody. And just a shout out to Ellen, because we stole a lot of visuals from your presentations. And next we go to Susan.
Hi, everyone. And I'm going to start with what I think is the major romantic theme of this section. And it starts right at the beginning of our section. These pictures obviously come from the television adaptation, and they very much accord with my mental image of these people. Jim, do you want to flip on to the next slide with the themes? So chapter 53 starts with Phineas's reaction to the news of Violet's engagement to Lord Chiltern. And Phineas, first of all, mechanically just continues to work, and then he sinks into gloom, alternating between despair and hope that, well, maybe the news is wrong, or if it is true, maybe Violet will change her mind. And I found it all a very realistic portrait of a reaction to bad news, particularly bad news which you receive at work. And the rest of chapter 53 is devoted to Madame Max's dinner party, where Mrs. Bonteen, who is one of those really unpleasant people who like stirring up trouble, alludes first of all to the duel between Phineas and Lord Chiltern, which is something of an open secret in society, and then to Violet's possible engagement to Lord Chiltern, which is particularly insensitive, as two of the guests are Violet's unsuccessful suitors. And faced with a direct question, Phineas confirms the news that the engagement is true. And when the rest of the guests have gone, Madame Max shows Phineas real sympathy, reassuring him that he hasn't, as he fears, made an ass of himself, but she still cautions him against wearing his heart too much on his sleeve. And he obviously finds comfort with her, because 4 days later he's back visiting her again for some more consolation. The following chapter, chapter 55, we see the reaction to the engagement from the, so to speak, adults in the room, Oswald's father and Violet's aunt. And Oswald's letter to his father, telling his father of the engagement, is incredibly awkward, mostly because Oswald is absolutely determined to do and say nothing that his father could possibly interpret as an admission by Oswald that he's been in any way mistaken. And Lord Brentford is initially, and perhaps understandably, angered by the tone of Oswald's letter, but then he focuses on the substance. This is, after all, the engagement that he and Laura have wanted for so long. And the meeting between father and son, when it does take place, goes better than expected, largely because Oswald takes his father by surprise and so is spared his dad's prepared speech. But even so, at the end of that chapter, there's a hint of trouble to come. Lord Brentford thinks that Oswald should apply himself to a useful occupation, preferably politics. Oswald says, no, I'd rather spend my winters hunting and my summers traveling with my wife, even though Violet subsequently tells him that he's wrong in this. And Violet and her aunt, Lady Baldock, provide some perhaps much needed light relief. Violet replies very blandly and frivolously to all her aunt's concerns about the engagement, and deliberately uses racing metaphors, which she knows will wind her aunt up, as indeed they do. At the end of chapter 56, Lawrence Fitzgibbon tells Phineas that Violet has quarrelled with Oswald. Maybe all is not lost. In chapter 59, Lord Brentford finally hears from Oswald of the duel, and Lord Brentford is, as a result, very angry with Phineas, who has taken the Standish family's friendship, and indeed their rotten borough, or pocket borough to be more polite perhaps, while pursuing Violet in competition with Oswald, even though he knows the Standish family's wish that Oswald should marry Violet. Lord Brentford took Phineas into his confidence, and now he feels betrayed, and he's angrier still because Phineas is no longer MP for Loughton, so it's too late for the Earl either to force him to give up the seat or for the Earl magnanimously to forgive Phineas. In his anger, Lord Brentford inadvertently confirms that the engagement is indeed off. He offers to forgive all if Phineas will promise to give up Violet, but Phineas refuses. Phineas now desperately wants to know whether there's some hope for him with Violet, but he finds it very difficult to establish this. And eventually, at the Duke of Omnium's splendid Riverside garden party, he asks Violet outright, and she tells him that despite breaking off the engagement, she still loves Oswald. Over to you, Jim.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, on to the next romance of Marie and the Duke. And once again, here are the photos from the Pallisers. Marie is sort of, wouldn't say she's infatuated, but she's really values her friendship with the Duke because his society makes her respectable. But at the same time, you know, sort of the clueless Phineas who's mooning over Violet. Marie plays it very cool. She's clever as she consoles Phineas. She's a little critical, but she doesn't go overboard. And she merely suggests there are other fish in the sea and boosts his confidence. And Phineas just can't see that he could hook her if he wishes. And she says he has the quote, the ball at his feet. And he's done this without any advantages of high birth. But she's still playing along with the Duke, claiming to be quote unquote not at home when he first calls. Coquettish, if you may say, and gives her an opportunity to write him a humble little note on the delicately scented paper, which he truly loves. Now, Marie flirts with the Duke when he visits. He invites her to a large dinner party where she meets the creme de la creme of the society. And the Duke starts to visit Madame Max at home regularly. And at the third meeting, he says, "You must come," to his villa at Como. And she refuses because the world would say she was his mistress. But it continues. The Duke, who is so smitten, has decided Marie is the top brick in the chimney, as Trollope said. He likes her wit, her beauty, her company, and she reminds him of when he was a young man. He'd fallen in for Greece for a girl who's charming, beautiful, spurned him in favor of a Russian merchant captain. But at this time, and as this wonderful visual shows, Lady Glen turns up, astutely bringing her son with him, who charms the Duke and precludes conversation. Then, Susan, this is yours.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks, Jim. After her visitors have gone, Marie meditates on her options. Would marrying the Duke make her happier or her hours less tedious? The prospect of life on the Italian lakes with an old man isn't really quite as charming to her as it is to the Duke. She recognizes that she could take pleasure in defeating the maneuvers of a clever woman like Lady Glen, but what further benefit would marriage to the Duke bring her? She's already got, she says to herself, money and position, and she's free as the air to go where she will. And she thinks of perhaps going to the Italian lakes with a companion that she would find more agreeable, and smiles rather sadly. And it's clear to the reader that she's thinking of spending her time there with Phineas rather than the Duke. But then she remembers the fantastically high status of the Duchess of Omnium, and it would be such a splendid revenge on all those women who've scorned Marie. And on the Saturday, 2 days after Lady Glen interrupted them, the Duke returns, and Madame Max has come to no decision in the meantime, except that The Duke must be made to ask plainly. And they flirt again. And eventually Madame Max extracts an explicit proposal and asks for 2 more days to think about it. And she spends that evening enjoying her success, whether she refuses or accepts the offer to have received a proposal from the Duke of Omnium. That's a significant achievement. And when Phineas then visits her, which has become a habit, on Sunday afternoon, and she initially thinks, oh, well, no, I'll opt for Phineas, I'll refuse the Duke. But then with his usual sensitivity or lack of it, Phineas talks of his love for Violet, whereupon Madame Max thinks, oh, blow it, I think perhaps I will go for the Duke. And while she's still dithering, Lady Glencora returns. Next slide, thank you, Jim. While Marie's been contemplating her options, the Duke of Omnium has told Plantagenet that some proposed business arrangements must be put on hold for a little while because it's possible that the Duke may marry, in which case the arrangement would no longer be convenient. Planty, being Planty, says to the Duke, well, I hope you'll be happy, goes home, tells Lady Glencora, and goes back to his budget. Lady Glencora, however, realises there's no time to waste, and on Sunday afternoon, she calls on Madame Max. Lady Glen is embarrassed. There is no way to say what she wants without offending Marie, but she rushes on. She stresses she's acting in her son's interests. She herself has all the world could give her. Planty has his career. In fact, there's a bit more to it, I think, than just wanting a title for her son. Her son is the thing which has made sense of Glencora's sacrifice of Burgo Fitzgerald. It's made it worthwhile. And if her hopes for her son now are denied, that sacrifice was all in vain. So Glencora cross-questions Marie on whether she's engaged to the Duke. She reminds Marie that she's already got money and position and is free as the air. She echoes the thoughts and even the words that Marie herself has used. And then Glencora goes further and says, just for a title, Marie, you'll rob the Duke of his friends, you'll embitter his life and degrade him. And at this, Marie, who's borne it all incredibly patiently, finally reacts. And we put their next slide exchange on the slide as it's so key. Marie admits the Duke will exalt her, but she refuses to concede that she will in any way degrade him. But nonetheless, what I think is wonderful is, despite her justified indignation, Marie retains her sense of humour in this. And Glencora has to leave without knowing how matters are going to turn out. Glencora then thinks she will have a go at persuading the Duke against the marriage, but the Duke's anticipated this and has fled with his valet to Brighton. Glencora, it's clear, will go to almost any lengths to prevent this marriage. She starts musing about the possibilities of getting the lesser ranks of royalty to use their persuasive force. The risk of an heir from a late marriage was a real one, as Trollope was personally aware. His father had been heir to a childless uncle with an estate in Hertfordshire, and the uncle suddenly married. His wife had a son, and the fortunes of the Trollope family suffered a significant setback as a result. Next slide, please, Jim. After Glencora's left, Madame Max dithers for one final evening, but she finally reaches a decision on Monday morning, and she writes 2 wonderfully eloquent and generous letters, and we put key parts of both on the slide. To the Duke, she stresses the honour he's done her, but says if she accepted his offer, she would injure both of them in character, not because of anything she has done, but because her birth and her position in society means she's not fit to be the wife of the Duke of Omnium. She stresses her gratitude, and she doesn't mention any of her personal reservations about constraints on her freedom or boredom of life with an old man. And she's similarly generous to Lady Glencora. She writes to her very promptly, both to put Lady Glen out of her misery, but also because it'll be very sweet to Marie to be able to tell Glencora that she was better and more rational and wiser than Glencora thought. She assures Glencora that she represents no threat to Glencora's family, but warns her that her argument about degrading the Duke could very easily have backfired. And Glencora's initially angry when she reads the letter, but she's honest enough to be angry with herself. And early the next morning, she goes alone, this time, to Madame Max's house to apologise. And the reconciliation is a lovely scene. Both women maintain their sense of humour, but they also speak seriously and they part as friends, though Glencora still thinks it would be wiser not to let the Duke spend too much time with Marie alone. Back to you, Jim.
The next romance is about Phineas Finn and Mary Flood Jones, and this is in anticipation of Mr. Monk's and Phineas's triumphant visit to Killaloe. And basically, he's really treated her badly. And Mary tells Barbara, I'm over Phineas, but Barbara's unconvinced because she can see right through it. And Mrs. Flood Jones tells Phineas, this is during the visit, you're forgiven for playing around with Mary's affections. Mary's no longer interested in him, and you should marry a nice English girl with a little money. Now, those are the romances, and this is really the unromance of Laura. I mean, this photo just says it all to me. I mean, look how miserable Anna Massey is playing Lady Laura, and Derek Godfrey is just, and he looks evil and mean. And Laura says, he simply chooses to have his own way, and his way cannot be my way. He's hard and dry and just and dispassionate, and he wishes me to do the same. That is all. And to hear her pain as she says this, and this is why we wanted to grab this quote and focus on it. There's no tyranny to a woman like telling her of her duty. Talk of beating a woman. Beating often may be a mercy. I mean, just awful. There's nothing to be done, she said, clasping her hands together. For me, nothing I have before me, no escape, no hope, no prospect of relief, no place of consolation. I think we all feel really bad for Laura. Susan.
Okay, and most of these chapters are about society politics, but this is, after all, still one of the political novels, and there are some parliamentary politics too, particularly the difficulty of balancing power and one's personal career progression with one's principles. And that's been hinted at from the start, and it's now becoming an acute issue. Mr. Monk, who we see here again from the BBC television adaptation, he's becoming rather sick of the restrictions imposed on him as a member of the cabinet, and he discusses political honesty with Phineas. And Phineas enjoys those discussions. He's not yet facing up quite to the reality that since he's accepted office, he must abandon the idea of independent action if he's going to be either useful to the public or have a successful career. He's very annoyed when people suggest he's just a mouthpiece for the government, but Monk tells him, you've got to choose. If you make Parliament your profession, you can't think of independence. And there's a very concrete problem coming up. Phineas is going to have to vote for the government's Irish Reform Bill, which will, like the earlier English Reform Bill, abolish his own constituency. His best bet is that this isn't going to happen for a year. On to the next slide. Thank you. Chapter 58 starts with Phineas and Mr. Monk discussing Irish politics. Monk is opposed to Irish independence, but if Ireland is to be part of the Union, which is, he thinks it needs to be because that benefits England, then it behoves England that Ireland should at least be treated well. And Monk personally would be in favour of disestablishing the Irish Protestant Church, given that most of Ireland is Catholic. But he thinks, frankly, that problem is intractable, and it would be rather easier to do something about Irish tenant right. And this was very much a live debate at the time the novel was written and published. It is, I have to say, having looked into it, a fiendishly complicated question. And fortunately, at least for this reader, the novel doesn't depend or focus on the detail of Irish tenant right. Rather, this is the concrete example by reference to which the question of loyalty to your party and loyalty to principle is played out. At any rate, Phineas invites Monk to come to Ireland with him in the summer to see the position for himself. The two agree that, frankly, most MPs know more about the African interior than they do about Ireland. And Phineas feels very proud when he writes to his home to his father to say, can I bring home a cabinet minister with me? And Phineas's reputation is already pretty high in Killaloe. He's earning £2,000 a year before he's 30, and even more remarkable, he's actually paid back his father's loan, which his fellow residents of Killaloe regard as little short of a miracle. And this slide describes his, or their, triumphant reception in Killaloe. Anyone who had doubted Phineas's ability to succeed in Parliament is finally convinced that he has succeeded. And this is the slide I put together looking at the structure of the novel. As I've read it, I've wondered whether Trollope wrote deliberately in serial installments. The illustrations were spaced out so that there was one per installment, but I wondered were the chapters similarly written with an eye to serialization. And here I have to acknowledge thanks to Peter Fink, who kindly provided details of the original serial installments, which I've shown with the grey bars in the table. And the first thing that really struck me was the way that Trollope manages to keep so many narrative threads going through each installment. The themes are just as intertwined as the characters are with each other. Only the Mary Flood Jones theme is not recurrent. It's a sideshow, rather as I think she is, at least at the moment, a sideshow in Phineas's own life. Trollope was more subtle than to end each installment with a cliffhanger, though he certainly does in some cases. Chapter 57 finishes with a real cliffhanger when Lady Glencora interrupts the Duke and Marie's tete-a-tete. And chapter 61 ends with Glencora's plea to Marie. The reader, like Glencora, is left in suspense as to how Marie will resolve the question of her engagement to the Duke. Chapter 64 ends with two little clifflets. How will Robert Kennedy react to Laura's departure? How will Phineas react to the news that, despite the broken engagement, Violet is still not, he has no hope with her? Similarly, the installments sometimes, but not always, coincide with narrative gaps. Chapter 54 continues immediately the morning after Madame Max's dinner party, with which chapter 53, the previous installment, ends. And there's no gap between the end of chapter 61, which is Sunday evening, and the start of chapter 62 on Monday morning. But there is a big gap between chapters 64 and 65. 64 ends with the garden party on the 27th of July. 65 starts with Phineas and Monk going to Ireland on the 7th of August. And whether or not there's a gap in the narrative, Trollope does, where necessary, remind the reader of key events of the last installment, but he does it very subtly. I was never aware of being bored by repetition. And there are, Jim alluded at the beginning to internal echoes. Most obviously, the duel in words between Glencora and Marie echoes that with pistols between Oswald and Phineas. I talked before about Madame Max and Glencora using the same arguments and the same words for and against marriage to the Duke. Ambition in many forms drives many, but perhaps not all of the characters. I'm not going to say more about that because we think that's a good topic for discussion. And although this is a political novel, I think the politics here are a means to a narrative end, unlike, say, Castle Richmond, where the reader does get to see some detail of the impact of the potato famine. Here, I don't think there is any real detail of the practical impact of Irish tenant right. It's just a trigger for the power versus principle debate.
To that point, we were very glad as we debated about how much to get into the politics. We realized it was just, it's a part of the narrative drive, because otherwise it gets very confusing. Anyway, here's the questions for the breakout rooms, and Susan is going to put them in the chat. How would you compare Robert Kennedy with Louis Trevelyan, Laura with Emily, and Phineas with Colonel Osborne, and he knew he was right? Why is Phineas so oblivious in his dealings with Laura, Violet, and Marie? There's a terrific book by Shirley Robin Letwin called The Gentleman in Trollope, Individuality and Moral Conduct, in which she states the most perfect gentleman in Trollope's novels is Madame Max Goesler. And she describes a gentleman as honest, has integrity, follows the golden rule, and is highly moral. Do you, when you break out into the group, do you agree or disagree that Madame Max is the most perfect gentleman? And if so, why? And of these characters, Phineas, Madame Max, Lady Glencora, Lady Laura, who's ambitious? And is ambition a force for good for these characters? Thanks for listening. Back to you, Don. And I'll
Thank you
stop
for-
sharing.
And thank you from me.